Have you ever wondered why audio plugins are still skeuomorphic? Is it smart UX, or is it simply nostalgia? How has the UI evolution of audio plugins changed over the years? And stick around where I'll actually try and design my own audio plugin, trying to figure out what makes audio plugins look so realistic and what gives them that distinct character. So in preparing for this video, I kind of realized that doing a history of audio plugins is actually a lot more complicated than I thought. The history of audio engineering is vast, and even if we just look back at the last 4 or 5 decades, so much has happened, and there's so many people who are way smarter than I am when it comes to audio equipment, what specific outboard gear and mixers were relevant at the time. I still think it'd be worth to understand this topic to check out some of the history of audio engineering and where exactly software audio plugins originated. So for me, the beginnings of sort of what we know as modern audio engineering kind of began, I would say, in probably the 1960s. I always looked to a band like the Beatles, being the sort of pioneers who experimented with new techniques such as multi-track recording and even incorporating some outboard gear such as plate reverbs and spring reverbs. These techniques were quite new at the time because previously music was recorded as performances, either direct to vinyl and then later to tape. And with the advent of multi-track recording, suddenly engineers and producers had the ability to manipulate sound as it was coming in, but also be able to create mixes before finally printing it to tape. It's important to understand that in the context of what will later become digital, producers and engineers interacted exclusively with physical hardware. And some of the things that we take for granted today when we see people using digital audio workstations or DAWs to edit audio, to correct takes, in the past that wasn't the case. So for me, the 60s is kind of this jumping off point where things started to get a little more interesting, with audio recording not just being recorded performances, but the art form taking shape in that mixing and the art of recording became just as important as the performances themselves. There's a really cool YouTuber named Rob Scallon that you can check out. He did a video on the history of reverbs, from spring reverbs to plate reverbs, and it's a really fascinating video because it kind of ties into this topic of the design of audio hardware and the design of outboard gear in specific. Because a lot of times engineers were very limited to hardware in the past, and developing this gear often came at a specific cost and a trade-off. So as I began to kind of wonder about this topic and how the history of audio hardware relates to what we use today in audio software, I was thinking to myself, who could I talk to better understand this topic? And the first person that came to my mind was my cousin Stan, who is both a seasoned live musician and recording musician. And I think he has a really interesting take on the transition from analog to digital. And also as a product designer himself, has a very unique perspective on how these things have changed and kind of the pros and cons of the different approaches that developers take when creating hardware in both the physical and the digital domain.
I guess my first question is for you. I would love to know is, since you've obviously had a lot of experience in recording music and also playing music, or I guess maybe walk me through kind of how you saw the maybe analog world kind of turn more digital.
Yeah, so I guess there's a little bit of I can distinguish between a DAW, or that would be like a studio environment, because I worked in analog studios, and then actually, as you say, the outboard gear, which was usually in rack. So I remember as I grew up in Germany as well, my dad used to go to a studio. They used to master his tapes and everything. There wasn't really any American equipment. It was all kind of a Studer, Siemens, Telefunken, all the kind of Austrian, German, Swiss brands. And they are highly, rated even now, especially the vintage one.
So to better understand how plugins came into the picture later down the line, we have to understand what people were using in terms of outboard gear or hardware that was beginning to change how people mix and master music.
So outboard gear, this studio didn't have much, but I knew already even then, reading kind of the American magazines or even British. Yeah, I've seen the studios where there's racks of outboard gear, and so I only thought it's like, what are these black boxes, like 1176s and stuff like that.
The 70s would see the introduction of large-scale mixing boards, which really changed the game when it comes to how producers both recorded and edited the bands they worked with. A great documentary to check out is Sound City, where basically the entire documentary is an ode to the famous Neve board that was used in the Sound City studio in Los Angeles. It's really cool to see that a hardware board like that was engineered in such a specific way to produce a very characteristic sought-after sound that was heard on albums from bands like Nirvana to Fleetwood Mac. And in watching this and understanding that era, you begin to see how important the tools are that producers and musicians use on a daily basis, and how much those tools can color and affect the decisions as they produce the music themselves.
The first time I actually had a chance to see and touch an 1176 was in Canada. I toured with a band, and in that studio they actually had one LA2A, I think two 1176s and so on. So I've seen it work, and I asked the guy, so how did it, change the sound and everything? One of the pros of having the old analog world studio is, first of all, yes, it's tactile, you can touch it, but also it stayed in the same place. And when you looked at it, you knew what it can do to your sound. If you looked at a particular EQ, let's say, especially for some engineers who only worked or still worked on analog, if they look at a Neve, they can imagine like a Neve preamp with their specific buttons, the brown and kind of the blue and the red. They can imagine what it can do, and because of their experience, they know, like, if I put it on the acoustic guitar, I know what I can expect.
And now, while mixing boards typically had their built-in tools, such as your compressors and your EQs, outboard gear began to be more used in the industry because it gave flexibility to producers to pick certain sounds that weren't available on their mixing board. In the 70s and 80s, we saw the introduction of outboard gear that would later achieve legendary status, which would influence what we'll see later in the design of audio software interfaces. These units all had quite simple controls and quite simple metering. At the same time, we would also see the beginnings of digital entering the analog audio workspace with the introduction of digital reverbs and delays.
So there were some digital units used as outboard gear way before that, like a Lexicon reverb. Well, it's a massive rack, I think 5 heights in your rack, and then you had a remote outside.
My goodness. While the analog world was seeing changes in how music was being recorded and processed, all the while we would see the beginnings of the development of digital audio tools take shape.
Steinberg came with Cubase out. And this was a massive paradigm shift because suddenly you had this visual representation. I mean, from a UI perspective, it was quite... They might have stolen it from Pro Tools. I'm not sure which came first because Pro Tools was the first actually DAW. But this type of where you have a track from left to right reading, kind of like in Final Cut with the video, like a linear editing, and you have regions of some sort, that was introduced, and I was quite fascinated as a late teenager with that. Like, this is brilliant.
So in the 90s, we would see the digital audio workstation completely take over how recording was done, signaling the death of tape for many studios, Pro Tools being the most famous example, allowing producers and musicians to do what's called non-linear editing, where they could non-destructively edit the sounds they recorded and, of course, process those sounds too. And this is where we can finally see where audio plugins came into play and what they looked and felt like. In 1996, a standard was created called VST to enable engineers the flexibility to include third-party software into their digital audio workstations. Now, engineers weren't limited to the tools in their software, but were able to expand on that with units that were specific to the sound they wanted to achieve.
So, from the early days, I remembered one delay, a plugin. It was a delay made by Steinberg, and it was called tape delay. And so, before that, I have seen pictures where you have this device, Space Echo or Echoplex, I think it was called, where there was inside the tape, but it wasn't spooled like on a tape recorder. It was just a free running tape. Because before digital, you couldn't really record sound and then play back later. So tape delays were the first ones, and slow down. Hey, hello, guy.
Now, this is the fascinating part because the actual design history of UI plugins is kind of difficult to track down because a lot of the earlier plugins weren't as well documented. But what's really interesting about this is that you can see that plugins began with a very humble approach with the tools and technology they had at the time, and they progressively moved to designing these plugins to feel and look a lot more realistic to the tools engineers were used to at the time. So if we look at these plugins that would later become vastly popular in the engineering world, the question comes up of, why did they pick skeuomorphism as their design approach as opposed to something else? I
think a lot of that skeuomorphism originally was created for engineers and users who actually used it before, so they were familiar with it, So it wouldn't be, because technically, if you open in Logic any plugin, you can switch to a version without the UI. I don't know, you probably know it, right? And so these are your controls, and they will be sliders, buttons on and off, and that's really it.
And the other question is, what plugins did developers start to create? Well, it turns out they started to create the very same units we were looking at earlier in the decades prior. Waves was a great example of a company that took this approach to heart and consistently released audio plugins that very meticulously mimicked the real-life hardware that was often used in studios.
So Waves were probably one of the first known or commercially known third-party plugins that they didn't have a DAW, they had nothing, they just had plugins. So yeah, we were sharing those. They were coming around. I think their EQ was the first third-party EQ on the market actually being sold, called Q10, or I think it was a 10 band or something like that. I can't remember now. So I might actually look them up. So yeah. So especially in gold ones. So this was quite revolutionary because on your mixer you had only 2 parametric equalizers in the middle, so mid-bands. And that was already kind of very cool. Usually you would have just 1 parametric on your mixer, and suddenly you had 10 bands, so you could do surgical things like fixing sounds and stuff like that. I think that's the paradigm shift. Although on Neve you had an indented frequency band, let's say from 60 to 100 to whatever. On this one, you could just type in, especially if you knew what you're looking for. For example, if there's a resonant frequency and because this song is an A and this is really coming out as an E, a fifth, then if you just use a calculator or it by heart, sometimes it's 220, well then about 330 hertz is your E if that one is resonating. That's how a lot of engineers, especially if they work live, they have to recognize these frequencies quickly, to turn them down. And suddenly you could just type it in, which was brilliant.
So what exactly is skeuomorphism in this context? Obviously, there's a ton of videos on the topic out there, but just to recap where this comes from and how that applies to design itself, I think it's worth just recapping what it is. So I guess for me, skeuomorphism is a design approach where we mimic what we see in real-life objects. So instead of creating new and novel approaches visually, we rely on paradigms and physical things that we are already used to using. A couple of famous examples that we still see today in software design are things like the trash icon, or the pencil icon, or even the button itself that's in almost every app today. All those things have visual cues from the physical world around us.
The one thing I do hate about skeuomorphism, even after this time, even if they represent the legendary devices, is screws and rust, LEDs, heat sinks. So kind of the one-on-one recreation of things that don't need to be there. But marketing, or also kind of the branding of that type of device, which is kind of then imprinted in your brain and how it should sound. Sometimes that helps. I don't think it sounds any different, but because if you turn it off, it shouldn't. But I guess it
peak skeuomorphism, sort of ish at the time was when Reason came out. Remember Reason?
Yes.
The rack software. I think it was so nostalgic because it's they had the stickers, they had the Sharpie, labels, the screws.
And you turned it around.
You could turn it around. You can route.
Yeah, flip it.
And the cables jiggled and wiggled. I think there's some really nice,
Another episode, because virtual synthesizers, a whole other thing.
So I kind of realized that there's way too many plugins out there to do this topic justice from purely a design standpoint. So I got to thinking, what is one way I can learn about what design principles developers used as they were creating all these plugins to help professional audio engineers? And the best way for me to discover this was by trying it myself to better understand how they made these plugins look so realistic and how all these plugins conveyed that tactile feel that you see when you look at them and interact with them. Let's quickly jump into Figma and I'll walk you through how I designed this audio plugin and what principles I learned along the way. All right, so there's 3 principles that I kind of gleaned as I was trying to recreate this audio plugin. So as someone who has had quite a long history in podcasting and working on my own music, I've developed my own way how I like to process spoken word in specific. And a lot of times I reach for the same plugins. So I figured why not it be cool to try and design a single plugin with all those effects that I need all in one place. Now the first thing that every skeuomorphic plugin shares in common is this concept of affordances. Now if you're a designer, this word is very familiar to you and it has to do with how we convey visually what things are interactable. So as you can see here in this example, this is not my audio plugin, this is the one I picked as my sort of reference because I think a lot of times when you're trying to learn something new, the best way to do that is to pick a good example of a technique that you see that you want to replicate and to reverse engineer and figure out how they got there. So this plugin, for example, has very, very clear signifiers or affordances, which are namely the knobs. With affordances in mind, I figured, let me start there and figure out how I want to lay out my plugin. I really use 4 effects in my signal chain, so I figured, let me incorporate some visual hierarchy here, maybe giving a couple of effects more visual weight than the others, depending on how important they might be in the signal chain, or really just to break up the hierarchy visually to be a bit more interesting than just a series of the same size dials. And that's exactly what these guys did here. 2 small ones and 1 big one in the middle. The first thing I want to do is to figure out the affordances or signifiers, and I started with the knobs. As I looked at the reference design, I realized, how did they get those knobs to look so clearly like knobs or dials? And the first thing I went to was, okay, let me try and put some shapes into place. Let me try and put some inner shadows. And this was looking very cartoony, and I was not really happy with this. And then I realized a problem, and that is that even though I had the affordances in place somewhat, what was really missing to make this whole unit feel like something tactile was visual depth. And this is the second principle I noticed that skeuomorphic plugins tend to use. Visual depth is when we introduce something like a light source to create an effect that things are in a physical space. So here I kind of just added some kind of a gradient to the background, and things started to feel a little better and a little bit more like a physical unit might look like. The dials, unfortunately, were still looking quite cartoony, and I couldn't figure out why. I realized that the lighting on the knobs was way too blurry and way too fuzzy, making the dials look a lot more rounded than I wanted. If we go back to our reference, you can see that the lighting is quite sharp, indicating that these knobs are shaped like that. And so as I got to here, I realized that what was really missing in this whole story was shadows. And look at the world of difference that happens once we introduce shadows to our dials and we create a single source of light, which in this case is a top-down. Now we can tell that our plugin has depth. So at this point I realized, okay, let me keep going to figure out what else I can do to make this feel a lot more realistic. And that brings us to the third principle, which is details. I think skeuomorphism stresses the details like no other design approach does, and that's kind of where we get the effect that things look real. So as I iterated along, I figured let's add some things that might make sense that you might see on real plugins, such as a sticky tape label or an LED. I played around with layout and to see what might feel more realistic. I then realized that, like in our example, dials typically have these indicators to tell how far you've gone, either forward or back. Then I figured maybe I'm missing some iconography to help visually distinguish between these effects as opposed to just using text. Obviously this example didn't work out great. And as you can see, the iterations went along these lines. So what was the result in the end? This was it right here. So as you can see here, to reiterate some of the principles that we talked about, visual depth comes from obviously the shadows and the light source. And then as you can see, the light source affects every dial in a different way. So the gradients over here are different because they're on different sides of the unit. And details like this, you don't really notice until you start to look into it. And that was my textured version. So I decided to see what that might look like without the texture. And the things I noticed here that are important to stress are tiny details like these grooves in between these segments. If you can tell, these lines aren't just solid lines, but we're using gradients as well to create depth, and we're making sure that the lighting always matches where the light source is coming from. And finally, as the last exercise, I decided to take it to a Dieter Rams kind of area to see how much harder it is to do light interfaces than it is dark. And it turns out this was actually trickier to do, especially with these kind of concave knobs that I tried to achieve. Those are extremely difficult, and I feel like I've got somewhat of the way there, but maybe not 100%. So anyway, there's a brief look at my design exercise. And what it really made me realize was that I have a really big appreciation for designers who stress the details in their skeuomorphic work. And I think it's a bit of a shame that with the introduction of iOS 7 and what's become known as flat design, we've lost some of that character in software design that was so prevalent in the past. Now, I'm not arguing that skeuomorphism is the solution to better UX. I just think an exercise like this really helps you appreciate the artistic side that comes into design just as much as the more functional or logical side. So that brings us to the last part of this video, which is, where is audio plugin design headed today? In my opinion, what we're seeing today is really the best of both worlds being incorporated into audio software design. A lot of audio plugins that are coming out today are thinking outside the box and not being limited to mimicking physical hardware. But at the same time, what I love about it is that plugins are really something that are fun to use. And I think it's a good reminder to me that design doesn't have to be boring all the time. Design can be really, really visually interesting, fun, or even wacky, as long as it gets the job done at the same time.
From like a UI standpoint, like some things that you think they're really doing interesting things with the interface these days.
Well, I think ProQ from FabFilter, I think they managed to make the biggest leap from a hardware EQ, where you can imagine an SSL with 4 bands or whatever, to a completely new interface. But suddenly, which is, I guess, a great wave in, let's say, contemporary or modern UI UX approach. If all the nodes or EQs are off, why are we showing them? I know there's a bit of a discoverability in that. It might take you 2 days to figure that one out what it is. After that, I don't need to see all the knobs, especially if I'm going to use one band, right? So I think that is the best, because you go and literally grab the node, the first one you want to use, pull it down. And then you see, okay, I need to change it.
For me personally, a great example is what the guys over at Neural DSP are doing in their AMP simulator plugins. I have a couple of these myself, and I think it's a prime example of how they incorporate modern UX and UI approaches to also mimicking real-life hardware in their software, utilizing things such as 3D rendering and all the principles we described before, while also providing modern interfaces that are simple and powerful to use while you look for the tone that you need. So I guess at the end of the day, learning about audio software, audio plugins, the UI design of them, and how people interact with them has really made me realize one thing, and that's that as designers, we're people designing for people. And although a lot of times what we're trying to design should be functional, it doesn't mean that we can't pour our sensibilities into the work that we do. And people like us like for things to look good, to feel good, and to sound good. Well, that about wraps it up for this video, and I'm really curious to hear what you think about this topic. What are some plugins you've used? What do you think about the state of audio interface design? And what do you think is in store for us next? Thanks for watching, and I appreciate your time. If you like this video, then go ahead and click that like button. And if you'd like to watch more videos like this, consider subscribing as well. Catch you next time.